So the people have been talking about Nosferatu, and by people, I mean the liberal media elite scum that I associate myself with. And just like all the other sheep, I heard that it was good, and I went onto Letterboxd to see what other people were thinking, and needless to say, I was surprised. All the reviews implied that it was a little saucier than I would have thought for a movie that was a remake of something that was made over 100 years ago, but the reviews are fair. I walked out of the theater being like, yeah, there are quite a few things in this movie that might have been considered indecent or even illegal to show in a theater 100 years ago. But also, now that I say that, pre-code movies were fun, and this wasn't even American, so maybe not, I don't know. But I was really intrigued by this new addition to the fucked up vampire genre, and the more I got to thinking about the movie and the reviews, the more I was pretty sure that this movie would have had an entirely different vibe if Orlok had just been hot. Not even like hot, but maybe just anything that wasn't a rotting corpse. Because Orlok's dialogue, especially a lot of the stuff he says to the leading lady, kind of reminded me of a 13-year-old's Omegaverse fan fiction, but I think that's why I liked it, and I'm gonna try to explain why. I think that this movie is almost a romance. Kind of. I pitched that as kind of a clickbaity title to this video, but then I kind of talked myself into believing my own bullshit, so I'm gonna keep going. And in preparation to see this movie in theaters, I watched the original one, and I thought that it was boring. I'm sorry, Guillermo del Toro, I know it's one of your favorite movies, but I have iPhone brain, and there were no words. I was thinking of pretending I liked it, so any film bros who clicked on this video by accident might respect me, but frankly, I'm just too tired as a person to be thinking about that stuff anymore. That being said, I'm sure I watched it the way that the creators intended, on a plane, while I was spying on the girl next to me writing her New Year's resolutions on an incredibly bright MacBook. And while we may not have much in common, we both need to work on our posture. So we are sisters in that way. I think that the remake is really faithful to the original, plot-wise and vibe-wise. It follows Ellen Hutter, a haunted young woman whose husband goes to the mountains to sell real estate to an evil vampire, who then, obsessed with Ellen, comes to claim her and wreak havoc on her friends in her town. The color scheme in the movie is so desaturated, it almost felt like black and white to me, except for a few key moments where the sun shines in and Orlok is in danger. And I could tell that they really cared to do justice to the original because there were a lot of small details that were very similar, like a lot of shots with Orlok's shadow, as well as the arcane markings that Orlok's servant uses to conjure things. But the main change is that they made Ellen the POV character slash protagonist, adding to the part of her story where, minor spoilers, as a young, freaky deaky, magic-y woman, she was lonely and called out into the netherworld for company and astrally hooks up with Orlok, awaking him from his slumber with vibes so enticing that he orchestrates the entire plot of the movie to be closer to her. And while I genuinely think this choice was mainly functional, it covers up several plot holes and gives the story a more cohesive structure, I think that it had some consequences that I would now like to explore in excruciating detail. Because now they added this new dimension to the film where she hates Orlok, don't get me wrong, but she also kind of connects with him in a way that others shun her for. And he's a monster, but he also understands her like no one else does and worships her, even though at the same time he wants to own her and exploit her. And I don't know how much romance Robert Eggers has read, but I was weaned into pop culture in the middle of the Twilight craze, so I think I know a thing or two about monsters that want to kill you, but you love them anyway. It made me remember one of my favorite scholarly works in recent years, the ContraPoints Twilight video. So I thought I'd do a little digging, and by that I mean pretend to clean my room while I was watching it, and don't you wish you saw the other side of this room, because it is disgusting. So the video is nominally about Twilight, but she also uses the series to talk about romance and dark romance as genres, how they were culturally received, and what that means. I agree with her that it is weird that Edward stalks Bella and kind of wants to kill her, and it's totally fine to be uncomfortable when you're encountering a story where sexuality and violence are intertwined, but it's also fine to not be weirded out at all because it is fake and it's fantasy. And while there's always been a moral policing of romance novels, like Twilight corrupting the youth or convincing young women that actually it's really cool to have a boyfriend that stalks you, it's still a fantasy and it's wish fulfillment. The whole story is there to gratify the ego and absolve women of wanting what they want. She says that a lot of romance novels are actually about a female will to power, like how in Twilight, by the end of that story, Bella is a hot, rich vampire, or how by the end of Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth is the wealthiest person she knows. And she says that a lot of these tropes, especially the ones that are a little harder to wrap your head around, like non-consent, are basically there to absolve the reader of wanting what they want. She quotes that the bad boy gets to be bad so that the good girl gets to stay good. She can have a relationship without necessarily wanting it. And I think that this movie is all of those themes, but spoiled. Because honestly, Orlok is just Edward Cullen in a different genre. Because he's a monster that's obsessed with her, but he's not like a sparkly, brooding monster. He's like a maggot-infested, rotting corpse. And the more I thought about this movie kind of being romance-coded, the more similarities I came up with. So I thought that it might be interesting if I did a little more digging into some critically slammed and culturally shamed bad boy romance stories to see kind of how this movie shook up. And since I am pop culturally stuck in 2015, I read the infamous Harry Styles fanfiction turned book After, and the even more infamous Twilight fanfiction turned book 50 Shades of Grey. So After is about a conservative girl who enters college and finds herself in a tumultuous relationship with bad boy Hardin, who is an abusive boyfriend in almost every sense of the word. 50 Shades of Grey is about Anastasia Steele, which is a real name that a real person is supposed to have. And she's this mousy, shy college graduate who also gets caught up into this relationship with the controlling billionaire Christian Grey. After, I admit I only read about 100 pages because by then I felt like I had a pretty good grasp of its whole vibe. And also I was reading it on a computer at work and I was really afraid that someone was gonna look over my shoulder and arrest me. I made it a little farther into 50 Shades, and the only thing I really feel like I have to say about that is that the Jacob Black surrogate is called Jose Rodriguez, which sounds like she just substituted one kind of brown for another, and then Googled the most popular Hispanic first name and last name, and then put them together and pretended that they were an original character. Both of the main characters, Anna in 50 Shades and Tessa in After, are different in a way that their love interests appreciate. Tessa has a very clear, not like other girls complex, even going so far as to say that the other girls that Hardin, her love interest, hangs out with are sluts. Anna mentions that she doesn't consider herself very pretty, but also when she sees more than one pretty blonde woman, she calls them blonde number 1 and blonde number 2, which just feels a little like stereotyping and gross, if I do say so myself. And Anna really seems to hate herself, but Christian is, I would say inexplicably, drawn to her with this singular interest that he doesn't show any other woman in his life. Tessa is also special. She's the one girl that Hardin settles down for, kind of. After all, Christian Grey doesn't love. He f***s hard. But then Anna bites her lip and he's like, let me buy you a car. And in the context of a romance novel, that really makes sense. A lot of women really struggle to find themselves attractive or interesting. So it is a form of wish fulfillment to have a very special person think that you're special. And honestly, Ellen and Orlok have a very similar dynamic. She was this very haunted child. She was very strange and lonely. She had visions that made people think she was a freak, but he appreciated the very qualities in her that isolated her from her peers. Other people are deeply disturbed by her visions and her connection to the supernatural. Even her husband is pretty dismissive of her reality, essentially saying that he's really glad she's not having episodes anymore. But Orlok calls her a sorceress and makes it really clear that he crossed an ocean and killed like a lot of people to be near her. Tessa feels more free with Hardin than she does around her overbearing mother. Anna is always talking about her inner goddess when she's around Christian. And I should note that during a very explicit scene, Anna says that her inner goddess is doing the merengue with some salsa moves. And Ellen is also different with Orlok, although less in a rebelling from an overbearing mother way, and more in a we interact in a different spiritual plane than other people. And you recognize a power in me that the entire world regards as satanic and fundamentally evil kind of way. But I still think it counts. And there's also these elements where there is some fear, trepidation, if you will, about this new world that these women are entering into, be it drinking or BDSM or conjuring corpses back from the dead and psychically connecting across hundreds of miles. Tessa says that when she thinks of Hardin, she thinks of the pain he caused me and the deep sting of loss for who I had been. Because all three of these women are fundamentally changed by these encounters. And their love interests are all extremely controlling and scary. Christian talks to Anna like he is a middle-aged person scolding a child, which is literally something that she says. The second time they meet ever is because he's trying to rescue her from a gross guy who's trying to kiss her when she's drunk, because he was tracking her cell phone. She even says to herself, "Stalker, my subconscious whispers at me, but somehow, because it's him, I don't mind." Girl, please mind. But because I have studied up on my scholarship, I get that this is a common enough fantasy to be popular because it's relaxing to have someone who seems capable telling you what to do and how to live your life and providing you with everything even when you don't ask for it. And even though it's actually terrifying to have some guy tracking your phone, being assaulted by someone who they think is a friend is a problem that a lot of women deal with. And you're not supposed to want a rich, hot angel to descend from the sky and help you out when you find yourself in that situation, because you're not supposed to drink that much and put yourself into that situation in the first place. But given that we are human and that sometimes we do, wouldn't it be nice? And I think that's also a really interesting thing about Ellen's relationship with Orlok, because he really worships her, but he's a monster. And forgive me if this is a misquote, but he says something like, "In the essence of my soul, I am only a craving." He cannot love. He can want, but he doesn't know how to satisfy that wanting without literally possessing. And honestly, I think that that aspect of Orlok is something that all these romance novels are missing about this kind of relationship, because they're focusing on the fantasy aspect. Because all these guys, Orlok, Hardin, Christian, straight up suck. And in that way, I think that Orlok, except for the whole being dead thing, is kind of a more accurate representation of a controlling, abusive boyfriend than those other two are. Because Ellen is special to him, but that doesn't change his fundamentally selfish nature. So I guess I will give one feminist point to Robert Eggers for that. And while we're at it, I guess let's take a few away from me for enjoying Bullet Train after I heard all that bad stuff about Brad Pitt. But on top of all of this, another similarity is that at the same time, all these women are like actually scared of their love interests, but not as scared as they are of themselves. Tessa says this thing where they're in the car and Hardin's driving her to some unknown location to hook up or something. Hardin says, "Don't worry, I didn't bring you here to kill you." But then she thinks to herself, "I doubt he realizes that I'm more afraid of what I might do when I'm alone with him than if he was to actually try to kill me." That is an objectively terrifying thing to hear when you hang out with someone for the first time. But her biggest fear in that very scary situation is her desire for him. She's the one that she thinks she needs to be worried about. And I think that this also is a huge part of Ellen's character, because she's scared of him, but she also has this immense guilt for asking for his companionship. She thinks it's her fault that he's coming into town and killing all of her loved ones. She is terrified of him, for sure, but I think she's also kind of terrified of herself for wanting him, even if she didn't quite or even at all know what she was signing up for. And there's this sense of helplessness with both Tessa and Anna around their partners that's echoed in a more fundamentally scarier way with Ellen. Tessa says that Hardin's tone and dirty words make me weak, vulnerable, and confused. I've become a rabbit in a fox's trap. Anna also describes her relationship with Christian as the weird electrical attraction crackling between us, enslaving me. Ellen is terrified of Orlok, obviously, and she's terrified of how powerless she is from stopping him from killing her friends and destroying her town. But at the same time, she also seems the most calm when, okay, major spoilers, she resigns to essentially becoming Orlok's monster bride and sacrifices herself to save the people she loves. And honestly, without her death, this scene in a fantasy story would also be quite climactic, although in quite a different way. Tonally. It would be about letting loose and honoring that part of yourself that your lame husband dismisses. But that is not this movie, obviously. She dies. It's a tragedy. I have to admit, this is where my whole thing completely falls apart. I'm not even sure that Eggers himself was trying to say anything in particular about womanhood. In all likelihood, he just came up with this relationship as a plot device to give an 103-year-old movie the narrative cohesion that they just could not have been bothered to give less of a shit about back then. And even though it mirrors a lot of the tropes of the romance genre, at the end of the day, she dies at the end of this movie because Ellen dies at the end of the original one. But because it is so eerily similar to a lot of these violent, controlling boyfriend romance novels, I would posit that this movie functions as horror in the more traditional sense. Now I'm seeing it as another monster boyfriend story, but what happens when you let the boyfriend be a literal monster? Ellen's fear is so palpable, and not only of Orlok, but also of her connection to him, and the part of her that relates to something in him, and also the part of her that does kind of want him in spite of everything he represents. But since no real gross boyfriends are going around turning into 5,000 live rats, I think that it is kind of an allegory for being with someone who scares you and also everyone around you. But then again, I do not want to make any huge sweeping conclusions, because if I did, then the argument would also stand that there might be a way that the violence of a terrible person was brought on by you bringing them into your life, and also that it might even be necessary to sacrifice yourself in some way to stop that person from continuing to hurt people, which obviously I would never want to say. So while it doesn't mean everything that this movie shares a lot of romance elements, I also don't think it means absolutely nothing. Dark, problematic romance is an incredibly popular genre, mainly because I think women are socialized to be good and proper, but they're not more good or proper than any man. And if men get to have freeporn.com bookmarked on their laptops, women get to read about Beta Dean Winchester being impregnated by his Alpha Castiel. And call me a loser and put me in prison. But as a dark romance love interest, Orlok actually isn't all that bad. He recognizes a power in Ellen that's diminished even by her husband. He paid attention to her at a time when no one else would. He wants her to be his, and he is willing to cross an ocean to make that happen. That, minus all the dead people, sounds like it could be making the rounds on Book Talk right now. However, this is not a romance, it's a horror movie. And while he has all the traits of a controlling, gross older boyfriend, he also, again, is the literal embodiment of evil on Earth. Because it's Dracula, and it's vampires, and it's honoring 100-year-old horror conventions. But when someone special, in any kind of way, thinks you're special, doesn't that make you feel powerful in some way? And when someone hurts you, like really, really hurts you, don't they feel like the embodiment of evil? Plague of rats or no plague of rats?